Sorry, I've been away for about a week. I actually went down to Sydney to do a course in NPL, which is Neuro-Linguistic Programming. If you haven't heard of it, it is essentially looking at ways we communicate and looking at better ways that we can communicate. It was a very intensive course. It went for 8 days and it was pretty much sun up till sundown, so 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. every night, every day, and homework as well. So I was a little bit tired when I got home, I have to say, but brilliant, definitely worth doing, and not just for someone like me who's interested in psychology, because at the end of the day we all communicate, and I imagine, hey Safwan, I imagine most of you who are watching these videos are interested in finding better ways to communicate, whether that be with your romantic partner or with your children, family members, friends, people at work. We communicate every day with people. Hey Tom. So if you haven't heard of NLP and you're interested in learning better ways to communicate, I would strongly recommend looking into it. Even if it's just the sort of level 1 course, there's so much to be learned in the way that we phrase things, the way we interpret messages. So in vain with that, I will kick off tonight. So tonight's around nonverbal communication. So I've talked a lot in the past about various ways that, say, men and women communicate differently. Different brains seem to operate a little bit differently between the genders, not always, but there is some common themes there. With nonverbal, hey Paul, with with nonverbal communication, a very common study that gets referred to as one done by UCLA, which found that it's only 7% of the words that we use is how we communicate. The rest is through nonverbal, and that's a range of our nonverbals. So that's eye movement or eye contact, our postures, our gestures with our hands, our tone of voice, pitch, speed of our voice. Trying to think, is there anything else? Body language in general, facial expressions. So all of these come into play, and there are some cultural differences with some things, but there's certainly a lot of gestures that are universal, that go across all cultures. So if I was to put my hand up like this, definitely means stop, doesn't matter what culture you come from. There's certain gestures that mean various things. So a classic one for us is to say everything's okay, whereas in other cultures it can be considered quite rude and disrespectful. So it's good to be mindful of those if you are traveling. But for the purpose of this, I'm just running through just how important nonverbals are with our communication with partners, with anybody. So understanding how important nonverbals are. So even if you were to switch the sound off on this and you were just to watch me, then I would still be giving you messages. So you would see that there were certain body movements, head movements, facial expressions that you'd be able to understand some of the content. So if I had a certain facial expression, that conveys a message. And we've been socialized to trust these messages, and we've been interpreting them since we were very little. Of course, you know, it's always good to ask questions to clarify something that doesn't quite look congruent. So when somebody says something, but the tone of voice doesn't quite match, I think a classic example is Seinfeld. So for those who've seen the Seinfeld episodes, you would know that there's a character called Newman, and Seinfeld does not like him at all. So when he walks in, he will always say hello to him. But the way he says it, it's certainly not meant to be a friendly hello. And it's very obvious by his tone of voice that it's almost like a disgust, like, what are you doing here? So that's a perfect example of how incongruent messages get sent. So the words convey one thing, but the nonverbals are a lot stronger, and we interpret nonverbals so much more than we do the verbals. And this is why when we're having discussions with usually loved ones and, hey Andy, yeah, sorry, I've been away for a little bit. This is why when we're having discussions, particularly with friends and loved ones, family members, because they can read our nonverbals so much more better than other people, so strangers, because they've grown accustomed to signals. Even if they're not consciously aware of it, they know when you're annoyed, they know when you're not listening, they know when you're lying in most cases. So the things that you say don't have anywhere near the weight as the nonverbal messages that you're giving across. And the reason these nonverbal messages are really the thing that we focus in on is because they're instinctive. They come from our emotional body. So, for instance, if your partner says, "How does this look on me?" You know, your emotional response may be that, "Oh, what do I say? I'm going to get in trouble if I say the wrong thing." And you say, "Yeah, no, it looks good." But your emotion may think that it looks good, but you've immediately had that stress response and think, "Oh shit, what do I say? I don't want to upset her and offend her and have a bad evening." So that's your emotional nonverbals has given that message. The words have said, "It's good, looks great." But of course, you all have, I'm sure, been in the circumstance where then an argument unfolds, or "Fine, I'll change. I know it doesn't," you obviously don't think it looks very good because what's been interpreted is the nonverbals. As I said, nonverbals come from our emotions, so it's quite instinctive. So it's very hard to fake your nonverbals. And particularly in a counselling or coaching arena, that's where nonverbals are a great cue for a therapist. So when somebody's talking about something, when their nonverbals aren't congruent with the words that they're saying, that can be a really good indication that there's a deeper issue there. So that's why a therapist would then start to ask questions, because they notice something is different, something's changed. So what's going on? When you talk about, you know, that time at school, I noticed this about you. So sometimes people aren't even aware of the nonverbals that they're giving off, but obviously that's what a therapist is trained to do, to tune into. Another reason why nonverbals are so important is in developing rapport. So what I mean by rapport is when you have that openness with a person, you feel a certain level of connection, there's either a common ground, you've had a common experience, similar age, you've got kids the same age, you may have the same interest in music, but generally there's a common ground that you find. And in so doing, the nonverbals start to really show that there's rapport between people. So when you see people talking and you can't hear the content of what they're saying, it's very easy to see when people are in rapport and when they're not. And of course, if you're not in rapport, communication just shuts down. You know, you're not going to get open, honest, authentic communication if you don't have rapport. And this isn't in a professional context. This is just even talking to your kids, talking to loved ones, friends, co-workers. We need to have rapport for our message to be sent, but also to ensure that the message received is the message we intended. When you see people in rapport, quite often things you'll see in their body language is postural changes. So there'll be more of a relaxed posture. The shoulders will go down. If they had their arms folded and they're a little bit closed looking, they may open their arms and lean forward. Mirroring, so they start to copy some of the gestures that the other person's doing, or matching their tone of voice. You see this quite often when you have close friends, and they almost seem like twins, because you know they do actually copy a lot of the mannerisms that the other person does, because they have such rapport there. So if you're finding that the communication is starting to get a little bit strained with people, stop and think about the nonverbals that you're using. So make sure the eye contact is there, the posture, the tone of voice in particular, and the pitch, the tempo. As I said with that example with Seinfeld, there's a lot to be said for the tone of voice and the intonation that we use with words. So, you know, you could say, I'm trying to think of a phrase that's common. If I was to ask one of the boys to pick up their school bag, and I said, "Can you pick up your school bag?" It's fairly flat monotone. But if I used a different tone, "Can you pick up your school bag?" Completely different tone, same sentence, but it sends a very different message. This is the same for every sentence that we utter. So we need to be mindful, if we're trying to build rapport, that we want to be mindful of the tone, the pace, body language, facial expressions. I'll go into... No, you couldn't, Andy. I just rattle on and talk rubbish. But thank you. So it's important to remember body language, or your nonverbals, will definitely... I was going to say the word corrupted. I don't know if that's the right word, but they will definitely be adversely affected when you're under stress. Quite often we are a bit more sensitive and misinterpret nonverbals when we're stressed, but also our nonverbals become very incongruent with the words that we're saying. So in order to be congruent or together or in flow, it's about being authentic to what you're saying, but also have an awareness. Self-awareness in most things in communication is key. So when you have an awareness of what your tone of voice sounds like if I'm presenting to a big group, depending on the size of the room, quite often I need a mic because I don't have a very loud voice, unless I'm yelling at my kids, then of course it's super loud. But under normal circumstances, I don't have a very loud voice that projects well. So understanding sort of how your tone of voice sounds, understand how loud or soft you come across to people, and you need to cater for that, because there's certain circumstances that you need to have a really nice soft voice, and there's other times, hi Amit, there's other times that you need to be loud and forceful in the conversation, and you may need to match somebody who has that tone of voice in order to develop the rapport. The other time, of course, is aggression. Your tone of voice is going to be very obvious when you're upset and angry, so you need to be mindful of having a little bit more control over your tone of voice, your posture, some of your hand gestures as well. Here I go, starting to use my hands. So all those things need to come into play. So the mindfulness is key, and that will hopefully help you to come across in a more congruent way. And if your meditation is a solution, absolutely. I totally agree. It will really help. Having some mindfulness when you have meditation, it really helps to unlock that understanding of our conscious and unconscious brain, that far too often we seem to get ruled by our unconscious brain, thinking that it is in control when in fact it's not. We have complete control over it, and I think meditation's a great way to illuminate that for you so that you can feel a sense of control again. And the mindfulness that I'm speaking of with the nonverbals definitely relates to that, so that you have some insight into how you're coming across to other people. Look, if your relationships are great and you're not having any major issues, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. There's obviously enough congruence with the words that you're saying and the nonverbals that you're projecting. But if you are finding that you seem to get misunderstood a lot or misinterpreted, people get offended by something you say, or the message just didn't hit the spot, might be time to take stock of some of your nonverbals. And I can tell you one of the best ways to work out your nonverbals is not necessarily doing a live, but video yourself. You could talk about anything, treat it just like a journal or diary, and actually listen to yourself speak. Have a look at your body language, have a look at your eye movements, your hand movements, maybe even pull the camera away further than what I have it, so that you can actually see all of you that another person would be looking at. And it may be, you know, you want to go and speak to your boss about a raise, or you've got a difficult conversation to have with a partner. Perfect. Practice it on video, see how it comes across, see how it sounds, as if you were listening to you and how you would interpret what you're saying. Switch the sound off, have a look at your nonverbals and just see, are there nonverbals that look like they're aggressive even though what you're saying is very calm? Because if it's a emotional conversation that you have to have, inside you may be like, oh, I've got to get this across, but you've managed to control the tone, but you may not have managed to control the nonverbals. And ultimately, if we're communicating with somebody, we're responsible for the response that we get from the person. So it's up to us to ensure that message is received with the intent that it was sent out. So that's it for tonight. Thanks guys for jumping on. I'll jump on again on Wednesday, so I'm back to my normal Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Just had a massive week last week doing some training, and there was no chance of me getting on by 8 o'clock down there. But thanks again. If you like it, share it out, and look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. Bye bye.